therapeutic service. So I'm going to introduce our second speaker now. He's an author of 5 books about history, travel and storytelling. He's a winner and multiple nominee of the Stanford Dolman Travel Book Awards. He's spoken at a lot of book festivals nationally and internationally, and he's also written for various publications including the BBC, Telegraph, Guardian and the Lebanese Daily Star. He started his career as a teacher in Palestine and has studied in Morocco and Iran, amongst other places, and his research has taken him to different countries including Afghanistan, Lebanon and Mali. Nick Jubber.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome,
Thank you very much for that introduction, Hasan, and thank you very much, Professor Skinner, for that fascinating presentation. So I have been very fortunate to be able to travel to lots of countries around the world, including many Muslim countries, including Palestine, where I started out after leaving uni as a teacher in schools in Jerusalem and Ramallah, and then traveling to places such as Iran, Pakistan, Syria, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria. And across these journeys, I've been researching in particular about storytelling and history and the connections between myths and stories and the history, and how some of those myths get passed down through the centuries and through generations and reinterpreted in the modern world. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these. I've been fascinated all through my life by the Jinn and the stories that I absorbed as a child about them, and stories that I've heard as I've travelled around many places in Africa, in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I'm going to, so one of the things that I've found from many of the places I've travelled into is that these, as Professor Skinner mentioned, the manifestation of the Jinn, or the way that they are perceived, often seems to be very different in different places, and seems to be guided by landscape and by the social milieu that people are coming out of. And so, for example, some of the first stories that I heard about the Jinn was when I was working as a student and teaching English in Jerusalem, and I would hear stories about the Jinn there, and they were often very, very specific and very consistent. One of the things was that the stories involved the Jinn who would have cone-shaped hats, which meant that you couldn't see their faces, and that their hands were also not visible. Sometimes they would be described as not having hands, or that you just couldn't see them. And they would also be associated with divination. So one of the stories that I heard was from an old man who, when he was younger, had come across, he believed he had seen a Jinn outside a neighbouring house, and it was a figure with a cone-shaped hat who was just lingering outside this house and then seemed to sort of fade away. And a couple of weeks later, somebody in that house died, and so he believed that that had been a sort of forecast of what was to come. I've also come across stories about the Jinn in the Sahara and amongst nomadic communities. So a few years ago, I spent a couple of years traveling amongst different communities in the Sahara from Morocco down to Mali. And you'd hear a lot of stories about either Jinn or some form of sort of spirit manifestation in the desert, and it's often to do with they would be appearing in terms of sort of sandstorms or dust or mirages in the desert. So the same things that are often described as natural phenomena in the desert, but given a sort of intensification that people responded to and interpreted as Jinn. And depending on depending on your viewpoint, you could argue whether that is a sort of form of sort of folklore or an actual experience of the Jinn, or a sort of combination. But the place where I came across the most specific narratives about the Jinn was in Fez in Morocco, and that's largely because I spent a large amount of time there, and so got to know people, because I think one of the things for people like myself as outsiders is that you need to sort of develop that level of trust before people will start telling you about those kind of experiences. And I'd seen, whilst I was living in Fez, and I was working there as a teacher, and I was also studying Arabic there, and I saw lots of signs that people would explain to me in terms of the Jinn. So, for example, blood on door lintels that would be smeared on the lintel the night before a circumcision, or the hand of Fatima that would be displayed as a sort of what's called an apotropaic way of warding off evil spirits, in this case the Jinn. And there was a particular person who I became friends with in Fez who told me about his experiences where he had gone down what you would say was the wrong path in life. When he was 17, 18, he'd got into a lot of trouble, got into a lot of scrapes, and he'd started hanging out with the wrong crowd, as he would put it. He was drinking a lot. He was smoking a lot of keef or cannabis, which is quite common in Morocco, and hanging out in abandoned buildings. And at some point in one of those buildings, which are often associated with visitations of the Jinn, he found himself possessed. Now, he didn't know at the time that was happening. It was only later that he interpreted it in that way. But his behavior became increasingly erratic, increasingly wayward, until eventually at a family gathering, he behaved very badly towards his brother's wife and was taken in hand by his family, locked in a room, and a ritual was performed. And in this ritual, they burnt some coriander seeds and recited a surah from the Quran. And he believed that then the Jinn came out of him. And the way that he described it was, I could feel the pain inside me, something that wanted to stay but was suffering. After the Jinn had left, I slept for a couple of days. I felt like I had been cleaned. Now, for me, when I was growing up in very sort of typical Western Christian environment, I was told lots and lots of stories about the genies, the Jinn, from the 1001 Nights, and I absolutely loved them. They were some of my favourite stories that I used to hear as a child: Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp, the Fisherman and the Genie, the Merchant and the Genie, and many others. And the idea that they gave me of the Jinn was that they were these incredibly sort of powerful but very beneficent beings who usually, if you found them in some kind of discarded item like a lamp or a cask of some kind, could grant you wishes. And often it was just 3 wishes, so you had to be very careful what you wished for. And often you had to be especially careful because the wish might end up rebounding against you. But I loved all those kind of stories. And so when I started traveling in Muslim countries and getting to know various communities in different places around the world, I was really puzzled by the disconnect between those stories of these fearsome but very benevolent genies and the rather disturbing stories that I was hearing about possession by the Jinn, or the experience that people have had with Jinn. And I became increasingly curious about what it is that makes that sort of disconnect. And I think one of the things is that the stories that have become popular in the West, the Oriental tales, the tales from the 1001 Nights that have been sort of absorbed into Western culture, are often, as always happens, they're a projection of that culture onto the culture that it is taking those stories from. And so a lot of the stories from the 1001 Nights that became popular in Aladdin is I think, the sort of at the very much the zenith of that, are the stories that communicate a sense of lavishness and splendor, because that is basically what Western merchants were and governments and so on were peeling out from the places where these stories were coming from. And we see this actually specifically sort of referenced in a version of Aladdin that was told in 19th century Denmark by a poet called Adam Oehlenschläger, and he retold the story of Aladdin as a parable for Denmark itself. The idea that this plucky nation, that it was like this sort of the plucky young youth who suddenly becomes enriched through mostly just sort of pure luck and a little bit of hijinks and good spirits. And that for them became a sort of parable for 19th century Danes of the great sort of economic resurgence that their country had. They hadn't been so successful since the time of the Vikings. So I think we have to sort of be careful when we look at some of those stories that have been sort of absorbed into Western culture, and then look at that difference with the stories that we're told more anecdotally. And so I wanted to go into, in researching this, and this is sort of what led me to corresponding with Professor Skinner and then to being invited here. In researching this, I wanted to sort of look back into some of the older stories and the older texts in which we see how the Jinn were perceived from this perspective of Muslim communities going back over sort of 1,000 years and more. And there are 2 texts that I thought I would talk about today. They are, the first of them is by a Sufi group called the Ikhwan as-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, who were writing in the 960s of the Common Era, and produced a text called The Case of the Animals versus Man Before the King of the Jinn. And it's a really good definition, I think, of how the Jinn were perceived in that time. So what happens is that there's a group of sailors who've been shipwrecked on an island, and they start hunting down the animals for their food and sustenance, but the animals are talking animals who are absolutely furious because they've gone to this island to escape from humanity. So they present themselves to the Jinn and to the king of the Jinn and say, can you arbitrate for us and get rid of these awful humans? So the king of the Jinn explains to the humans why he's going to arbitrate, and explains all about the Jinn, and he gives a sort of account of who the Jinn are. He says, "We are good and bad, both Muslims and unbelievers, some pure and some profligate, just as there are among humans. So well do the good Jinn obey their chief, that if some rebel Jinni troubles an Adamite or human with madness, terror, confusion, or panic, and a human enchanter calls for help from the leader of that Jinni's tribe, or from their king or his forces, they throng and rally round, doing just as they are commanded." Now, what I think is really interesting in this account is the way that he identifies the Jinn's effect on humans. That it's not that they're not like sort of typical monsters who could push and knock you over or cause you some kind of physical harm. It's through their effect on your emotions, through madness, terror, confusion, or panic. So it's the idea that they can possess you. And that idea is there in that text written over 1,000 years ago. Now, another example is a book that I think is an absolute world classic and really needs to have a lot more attention on it, which is the Risalat al-Ghufran, or Epistle of Forgiveness, by al-Mahri, who's a poet in Syria, who wrote about a journey to the afterlife. And this was written a couple of centuries before Dante's Divine Comedy, which some scholars suggest it may have even influenced. So I think it's a work of extraordinary global significance. And during the course of this book, the narrator meets Abu Hajrash, who is a very ancient Jinn in the paradise of the Jinn, and he tells them about his life as a Jinn. And it goes all the way back through hundreds of years. And he says that he was one of the early Jinn. He has experiences of the time of King Solomon and many others, all the way through to the time when the Prophet Muhammad was preaching, and then he converted and accepted Islam and became a Muslim Jinn. And he describes how in his earlier phase he was always up to mischief and always doing all kinds of terrible things. And in one case he wanted to possess to inflict with madness a young woman. And so he turned himself into a rat so that he could get into her house. But the people in the house set some cats upon him. So he had to go up a tree and turn himself into a viper. And then they cut down the tree, and so he turned himself into a wind, and then they were trying to deal with this wind that was suddenly blowing through the rafters, and that was when he was able to get his opportunity and to possess this woman's mind and give her a fit of madness. And he describes the many incidents that he would get up to. He says, "I'd be with drinkers to afflict them with mishap perpetual, while they played on their lute, their shalm, and their sitar. I would not part from them before they had performed a deed that would make Satan glad. I'd cheat a notary, make him betray the trust they had in him, and give false testimony." And this, like the other text that I mentioned from the Brethren of Purity, again, it's about the Jinn getting inside people, not knocking them over or causing them physical harm, but getting inside their minds and taking them over. And so it gives us an insight, I think, into how in what we think of as medieval times, the Jinn were perceived to be able to control people's minds in some way, to control their behaviour, which has a continuity with the sort of incidents and examples that Professor Skinner has mentioned earlier in today's event. So, for me, I sort of coming at this from a sort of outsider perspective, I'm interested in what we think of as the sort of the overlaps and continuities and correspondences between and across different cultures, and the ways that we can see connections, whilst at the same time recognizing the specificity within each culture and each community. And I think there are some fascinating connections if we look at spirit possession more broadly around the world. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of them, which is amongst Christians and Buddhists. So Christianity, of course, has had demon possession and ideas about demon possession for millennia. And if you go back into the New Testament, Jesus in the New Testament is described as calling out the demons from people who've been possessed and bringing them out of them. And if we go right through Christian history, the idea of demonology was so entrenched that King James the First of England and the Sixth of Scotland was obsessed with demonology, and he even wrote his own book about how you deal with demons and ideas about demon possession. And it goes right through to modern times. The Vatican, the Pope, actually issues has a text, a book about how you exorcise people from demons, which is still followed by priests who have been commissioned to deal with with demon possession. The last update was in 1999, so it doesn't get updated like very, very regularly, but it's still fairly recent. And I've spoken actually to a priest about this, not an exorcist himself, but who knows of the practice. And one of the things he pointed out to me was that it's sort of twofold, really, and I think there are correspondences with what's been mentioned about Djinn possession here, that it's both about the ritual and also about lifestyle. So that you sprinkle holy water, you recite certain sacred verses, and you perform what's described as a sort of socially sanctioned ritual that enables the individual, the patient, the person who's been afflicted in some way with this demon to be separated from them and to believe themselves to be separated from them. But you also look at their lifestyle. What is it in them that has made them vulnerable to possession? Is it that they're suffering from depression, from grief, from some aspect of their lifestyle? In the case of the person that I mentioned from Fez, it was to do with that he was living a very wayward lifestyle, and I think that's what made him sort of vulnerable to this kind of thing. And but where there is, I think, a very, very significant difference in the stories of exorcism, or Christian exorcism, and it's something where the films like The Exorcist have sort of sensationalized and create a sort of inaccurate idea about them, is that one of the key rules in Christian exorcism is that the priest should never speak to the demon, because the demon is cleverer than the priest. You are not going to be able to outwit the demon. That's as far as the as far as the Vatican's teaching goes. That if you try and speak to that demon, then the demon will probably find some way to twist it back against you, and then it's going to go terribly, terribly wrong. So the priest always has to try and to get round the demon and get to the patient themselves and to extricate them from that demon. But in terms of the idea of possession, I think there is very much a correspondence there. But again, there are these differences that in the Christian doctrine, the demon is seen very much as a pure force of evil. So there isn't that ambiguity that there is in accounts of the Jinn. Now, earlier this year, I went to Japan, and I was lucky enough to go at the time of the Setsubun, which is the Japanese New Year, when people bring old things from their houses and they put them on a bonfire and burn them, and it's the idea that you're sort of ritually getting rid of the old and bringing in the new. And at the same time, people go to the temples, which is where these bonfires happen, and there are rituals performed in which people dress up as demons, and they put on these masks with two horns, and it's a very sort of stereotypical kind of image of demon, which goes back to Buddhist hell scrolls from 1500 years ago. And the priests, the Shinto priests, and in some cases the Buddhist priests, recite certain verses, and a ritual is performed where a shaman will proceed with some acolytes around the temple precinct, reciting these verses, whilst the people who are dressed up as the demons act as the demons and are slowly dispelled and cast out back into the darkness and to the cold. Now, when I went there, it's very performative, and the idea of demons in Japanese culture, I think, is complex, but I think it's been very commercialized. You see these figures in supermarkets selling packets of giant sushi, for example. So it's not something you'd ever imagine you wouldn't imagine sort of having something similar to that about the Jinn, I don't think. But on the other hand, when I talk to people at this ritual, after the Jinn, the Oni, the demons, had been expelled and sent away, and I talked to a few people there, and they all talked about how moved they were by this ceremony and how they felt connected with their ancestors, and that sense that it's something that goes back over the centuries, and that even though it had lost its sort of sense of being grounded in pure reality and had become more part entertainment, part ritual, part a sort of communal gathering, still there was something that emotionally connected with people, and that feeling that when they were throwing their old things onto the bonfire, that they were somehow getting rid of their own demons. And there was one person who told me that he had come to this, he was staying in Kyoto University. It was the first year that he wasn't with his family, and he said that he'd been feeling very lonely, and coming to this event really made him feel like he was connecting back with his ancestors, with his parents and grandparents and forefathers, but also with the community around him. And it's that idea of sort of joining into a shared community experience. And I'm going to finish with an account that goes back, it's to the same sort of period as the account by Al-Mari from the 11th century, which is from the Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon. And this is about somebody who was possessed by a demon in medieval Japan and was exorcised. And she describes it as follows. The mistress of the house lies racked with suffering in the grip of spirit possession. A large number of gentlewomen are seated nearby as witnesses, watching the proceedings with riveted attention. It isn't long before the medium begins to tremble and falls into a trance, and the awesome power of the Buddha then reveals itself in response to the priest's invocations. While well aware that this suffering is the spirit's and not the girl's own, nevertheless, those who know her are filled with pity to witness her fearful lamenting and wailing, and they sit beside her and attempt to keep her clothing straight as she arrives there. In due course, the patient improves, and the priest orders that medicinal tea be given to her. Some of the younger ladies retire to the kitchen area to bring it, and they hurry anxiously back with it to see how she is. The spirit is forced to grovel and beg for forgiveness, then is finally dismissed. And I think this is, for me, quite a moving description because it's from so long ago. This is 1,000 years ago, and yet it connects with, for me, it reminds me of my friend in Fez who had believed that he was possessed by Jinn and the ritual that he went through to save him. And that idea that there is something inside you, something that is in pain as it's extricated, something that needs to be removed, and that sense of sort of being cleaned out and then exhausted by it. And it reminds us that whilst there are these very specific social and cultural details that come to the way that that spirits are perceived within different cultures, that there's also what Jung called that universal consciousness that binds us together, because we are all of us having to face in some way these menaces that imperil us and that are shared all across the world. So thank you for listening.